usual kind of mini pickup. Yeah, the mini pickup that you kind of never factor in, although you know that it happens. Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming to the Goethe-Institut. For those who are in Sydney and who I can see here now in the room, all you beautiful people, thank you for making it out here in the beautiful sunshine of Sydney. And also to all those people who have tuned in on Facebook or on Twitter. Thank you for joining us today in the discussion that we're going to have. And before we start, maybe someone can switch their phone off. There's a nice little ding happening here in the room. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to wholeheartedly thank them for letting us do our little thing here today on their ground. Okay, so today, this is a Goethe-Institut event. Goethe-Institut is a German cultural institution which runs language courses all over the world in 159, I think, places all over the world. And we also have an arts arm. And I'm part of the programming team that puts on cultural events. And the people who are with me today have both published in this area and have both are both practitioners as well. So we've got Goetz Richter here in the middle. He works for the Sydney Conservatorium of Music, which is connected to the Sydney University. And yeah, Goetz has a career not only as a practicing musician in orchestras all over the world. He's a violinist, very accomplished. He's also teaching, and he's also a great philosopher. Well, it is kind of your area, isn't it? So that will make things quite interesting for us because it's less of a technical background, but more of a thought leader kind of background. And Ollie over here, Oliver Bown from UNSW Art and Design, he also teaches, but he's also a practicing musician, has had bands like Icarus and Tangents in which he kind of manipulates and creates electronic music together with improvisers, and has also worked very heavily in the field of developing code, of writing, of actually on-the-ground work in terms of creating artworks, including not just sound, but also audiovisual installations in art galleries and places like that. So these are the two wonderful people that we have here today, and I'm very happy that you're here. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, both of them have written articles for this magazine. I'm not sure which camera. Anyway, it's called Kultur, and it goes with the Kulturtechnik website, and you can find articles by both of these people in there, by all three of us actually. So the idea that computers may or may not generate music is not super new. So it's traced back, I was recently told by Sibylle Krämer, a forscher, like a researcher who I've been in touch with, that I shall never forget that Ada Lovelace already in 1842 kind of said that the machine that she was thinking up or dreaming up would at some point be able to autonomously create music and create music, not only just some kind of music, but actually music that is interesting and engaging. So that idea has been around for a while. Of course, then there has been experimental electronic music. Contemporary composers have experimented a lot with tapes and with all sorts of other machines. And only like in the last couple of decades, it's become an absolute mainstream thing. It became like a high-tech kind of thing in studios for people to record, to produce music. And then it filtered through to every kid's bedroom, basically. So now we've got it all in our pockets, essentially. So when we talk about these things, I think we have to ask some really general questions about what it is to make music and what it is for if we hand over that kind of skill to machines, if we do that, or which parts we do. And Goetz, you have written about one of such projects last year, caused a bit of a stir. So it was the telecommunications company Huawei who claimed that an AI that they had developed was finishing Schubert's unfinished symphony, pretty bold claim. And Götz, you thought you had something to say about that. And you criticized it quite heavily. There are really good points in the article that you've written. One thing that I'm also interested in is why did you get so excited, or what is it that triggered this strong reaction for you to say, like, wait a minute, I have to say something about this project? Please help us out.
Thank you. Well, I am a musician, practicing musician, and one of my heroes is, of course, the composer Schubert. I'm actually the president of the Sydney Schubert Society. So when somebody made the claim that they completed the unfinished symphony of Huawei, I thought I'd have a look at it and have a listen, because obviously that was my immediate concern. And by coincidence, this claim happened exactly at the time when there was a large political discussion about the involvement of Huawei in the 5G network. So you can see, of course, where it's coming from. It's not actually a musical topic at all. It's a political topic, in a way. And so, anyway, I thought I'd give it serious consideration, have a look at it, and have a listen to what was being done. Because at the time, also, Huawei asked the Conservatorium where I'm working whether we might put together a symphony orchestra to play those completed 2 movements, or to put on a concert with those completed 2 movements. Anyway, so I had a listen, and I thought more about it. And of course, my point, really, it's quite a straightforward point, and it goes back to very fundamental philosophical issues that have to do with composition of music. What Huawei's system did is not particularly sophisticated or particularly new. Is just a way of assembling from a data set some things that seemed to the person who assembled it to fit into something that sounds a bit like Schubert, but actually in fact sounds like John Williams and bad Shostakovich in the end. But so the issue that started to really interest me, which is something I've thought in the context of my work as a teacher and performer, from the point of view of expert learning, the issue really interested me is how does this creativity actually work, and what happens when we ignore the authentic dimensions of creativity in such a blatant way to get some kind of commodified outcome. And that really worried me, and that stirred up my critical mind quite a bit, and it continues to do so, because I think that's actually where this AI and music issue converges to. It's a question on how do we see creativity, musical creativity, and particularly in the creation of music in the field of art music, in particularly because we have to remember when we talk about this topic, it's a very, very wide topic by virtue of the fact that we mean many different things when we talk about music. And so we have to be very specific there. But sorry, just to conclude that, in this particular concept with Huawei, it just became blatantly obvious that composition is not an assembly process of pre-given material. That's completely naive. No matter how you go about it, that is not only naive, that's actually very dangerous, simplistic view of musical creativity.
Okay. Just picking up on one adjective that you used, commodified. Would you say that it is in itself wrong for a result or for music to be commodified?
Well, it's not wrong or right. It's whether it's wrong, I don't know. Whether it's relevant to say whether it's wrong or right. It's a fact that music is commodified. It's been so for decades. Adorno already referred to that in 1938. And with this commodification come potentially dangers, but there come also opportunities, of course. More people can listen to music now than ever before as a result of commodification. So I'm not totally agreeing with Adorno's criticism that commodification is a terrible thing that changes the artistic authenticity of music necessarily, but commodification has dangers because it will transform our attitude to, potentially very fundamentally, our attitude to the subject matter or to the art, and it will change how we create, and it will change how we listen and attend. And that's, if we are aware of that and we continue to work on that, then commodification does not have to be or can look very different. So that's how I would say.
And Adorno actually wrote a couple of really cool string quartets, didn't he, as well?
Like he did. He was a
little known fact.
Yes.
Yeah. Ollie, what's your take on something like this Huawei coup, sort of, or this kind of like media the media trying to grab the attention of the general public, saying like, look what we can do. Like a machine, like a tiny little machine can now do something that other composers have taken generations to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely agree with Goetz about the. For me, it's really important just to be constantly interrogating the way that people are presenting claims in this space, and I'm always excited to see people doing stuff in this space. I'm very excited by the idea of seeing somebody set out on the intellectual pursuit of attempting a thing like that, and I think we should embrace that and celebrate that. Musicologists and composers and engineers and all kinds of people might come together and do some amazing work in that, and I think we've seen amazing work. There's a subject called systematic musicology or computational musicology that attempts to study the nature of existing music through the practice of doing data analysis on that, and also sometimes generating music from the point of view of trying to understand music, and that's what I'm interested in. But again, we're seeing so many of these kinds of, I mean, you can call it a gimmick, you can call it an advertising kind of trick, and I don't mean to be cynical, because I think, you know, there's all kinds of genuine, honest motivation and interest that goes behind people trying to do that, but you just have to keep an eye on those claims. So, I mean, I think Goetz has already expressed that really well, but the most obvious thing I think is that I don't actually know what they did in that project, but typically what we're seeing is the absolute hot ticket is machine learning. Machine learning is what everyone's raving about nowadays, and generally, I mean, we see all kinds of amazing techniques, and so I don't want to belittle and reduce the field, but the most common activity in machine learning means feeding a system which can learn with musical data, and then getting that system to generate output that mimics or in some way represents the nature of that data. And it does it incredibly well, but you just have to remember that that's what it's doing. And so when you compare that to what we're doing or what humans are doing when they're composing, I mean, just imagine the situation where all you were as a human being was a thing that ingested some musical data and then spat out some other musical data. It's not, it's evidently different. I think everybody knows that. So I want to simultaneously celebrate and encourage the intellectual work in that area, but also just, I feel like one of my jobs as an academic in this area is just to constantly be checking and kind of interrogating what the claims are.
Yeah, so you are also mentioning that in the article that you wrote for us in the Kultur magazine. I think in that particular case, it was literally the machine just suggested a handful of notes along the lines of what someone like Schubert would have written by going back and just analyzing the data that was available. And then essentially it was a composer, the film composer, name escapes me just now, but he kind of like put together the instrumentation for the entire philharmonic orchestra, which is kind of like the bulk of the work, of course. It's like a child suggesting, okay, maybe these few notes could now come next. And then the actual work is in this case, I think, was done by the composer. And what they fed us was like a 2-minute teaser with a behind the scenes kind of thing. And then like I don't know, 1.5 hour kind of like audio file that only Goetz listened to and no one else. So really like the depth is completely lost in the process, I think, for something like that.
I think that is the precise point. What Ollie says is quite right. We need to investigate the claims really carefully. What is claimed here about what the computer, the algorithm, or the AI has actually achieved. And you have something like Deep Bach, for example, that gets fed with 30,000 scores of Bach, and when it harmonizes a Bach chorale and makes elementary mistakes in voice leading that a first-year conservatorium student shouldn't make. Now that's not very smart learning, because if a first-year conservatorium student had studied 30,000 scores of Bach or something like that, that student wouldn't have made those mistakes anymore.
Okay, Ollie, help us out. You say we have to keep an eye on it, right? We have to be vigilant. Like everyone tells us, AI is involved in everything, and it's also a massive buzzword. A lot of artists kind of use it in order to get more traction. What is the frontier at the moment? What are the really genuinely exciting things that are happening? Like where do you see headway is being made, and you just go, wow, that was really cool, and something happened here that is really a step forward?
Yeah, I mean, the first point to make, I think everyone intuitively knows this, is that there's a certain sense in which we talk about AI as being the stuff we can't do, and everything else, everything that we can do, we're less mystified by. It's more run-of-the-mill, so we don't think of it as AI. AI has this weird association that we make. It's in the future. It's always just a little bit ahead of where we are now. But of course, the other common use of AI is that it's all around us. It's been in our spam filters and traffic light modeling algorithms for forever, not forever, for a long time. What's hot in music is, again, this deep learning field. So I'm sure everybody has come across that term, machine learning and deep learning. Deep learning is just the word deep there, just kind of neatly thrown in to represent the fact that we started around about the turn of this century. We started to get really good at making these neural networks on a big scale. So neural networks are systems that have no programmed knowledge in them. They have, what you do is you cleverly design the architecture of the network, and then you program that thing to ingest lots of data, and the network shapes its internal structure so that it can represent and have a kind of knowledge representation of that data. And some clever tricks, which I couldn't claim to properly understand, have meant that we're able to scale these to very big sizes and deal with more complexity. And partly that's just to do with computing power as well, which made a difference. That's really started to kick in music. So for a very long time, music generation was always, and Goetz has alluded to this, kind of just a bit disappointing. And it has taken leaps forward. So despite the fact that an expert like Goetz will always notice that, machine learning music generation can do a pretty good job of making some stuff that actually gets you interested, gets you excited, and has a complexity of structure. And that's the main thing, is it's the main frontier is this frontier of how these systems internalize and learn to represent complexity of structure. So one thing people talk about a lot is long-term structure. How does a thing that's generating musical notes actually generate something that has coherent and interesting structure on longer timescales?
And do these processes that you describe now, or that the way, the path that we're on, does it include the idea that computers or neural networks would completely autonomously create music that is actually enjoyable for us? I'm saying, like, without curation from humans, without cherry picking results or anything like that. Is that in the cards?
I've got two answers to that, like yes and no. I mean, basically, I'm a fundamental believer that, you know, the incredibly effective process of engineering means that we will just keep making these things better and better and better, and eventually, maybe in the not too distant future, you can press play on something, just, you know, one button interface, you just press generate, and out comes this entire piece of music. And that hasn't been kind of cheekily manipulated by someone who's actually doing all of the orchestration and setting templates and stuff. It genuinely come from the data. I believe that's perfectly possible, and I think we're starting to see that. But, and maybe it's time to throw to Goetz, that philosophically, does that constitute composition in any meaningful sense, remains open, and I hope remains something that, I hope the AI keeps stimulating us to ask these questions. And it's an amazing opportunity to actually reflect back on ourselves and think again intellectually about what it is we do.
Yeah, I think Goetz, this is your cue to talk about consciousness and versus intelligence, and also about the creative act itself. Like, what is it? What do we perform when we perform a creative act? And is a machine able to do that?
Well, first pick up something that Ollie just said, is that music, I'll come to the question very quickly, but music can be created by an AI system that is enjoyable for us, even in the long term. It really depends whether that's all we want from music. I think we can do many things with music and create it for many different reasons. But one of the great achievements of our civilization, to a certain extent, which is global achievement actually, is the creation of music that is so inspiring and so intriguing and makes us so curious that even 250 years or 300 years later, we are still trying to sense what meaning is in these pieces. And that's an incredible challenge to us in a way. You would have thought, oh, well, if it was just merely enjoyable, we'd be done with it already, and fashions would have changed, etc. And I don't know really enough about the field of AI comprehensively, but what has so far been generated or created, if you like, in that area by machines is not probably much better in an artistic sense than a novice expert kind of thing. And that hasn't changed since Dreyfus gave us the analysis in the 1970s of the limitations of artificial intelligence. And the reasons for that, and I think that's perhaps your question, is actually ontological, first of all. The creation of music is in an artistic sense particularly, is an event where something entirely new happens. Now, I give the best analogy I can think of at the moment is like this. Your Google, iPhone, whatever, can tell you that when you leave in the morning, because you've always done it, you will drive to work in 40 minutes. And it'll say so on your phone. And that's very clever because it takes, first of all, takes all the traffic routes, etc., and says the quickest way to the Conservatorium of Music will be 40 minutes. But what the Google phone doesn't know is that I'm not going to the Conservatorium. I just changed my mind. I'm going somewhere else. I'm going to WAG today, and I'm not going to go to work. So that is a spontaneous decision. How do I make such decisions? Well, we make those decisions based on a whole lot of reasons, but not only that. We make also those decisions that the philosopher Pascal called the reasons of the heart. Pascal famously said the heart has reason that reason doesn't know. And that's at the foundation of our action. Every day we make many actions based on this principle, not on data collection and estimation of what might be advantageous. We actually even do things that are not advantageous and not reasonable at this point, but might turn out later to be perfectly reasonable. We just didn't know. So we do operate with intuition, and the issue is that we need to create a new world ahead of ourselves. We cannot live a life out of existing possibilities and hope to maximize those possibilities. That's not, human consciousness and human life is not of this kind. And the second thing, that's an ontological issue. It's got to do with the temporality of our existence. The future is open and genuinely open to us at any point. That's at the basis of our ability of human freedom. And the second point, I guess, has to do with the belief in the AI that we can reduce intuition to computable sets of something. Even in deep learning systems, I guess that is still at the foundation of the metaphysics of the system. And I guess we could get into a huge and very protracted discussion about, there's the example of the computer or the AI system that is being able to beat the Go master, which is more intuitive and much harder than chess. That's one of the, watersheds in AI, I guess. But in music, the situation is even more intricate than in any game, because music is fundamentally unpredictable. And a composer creates, at any point, something fundamentally unpredictable. And the reason why we are fascinated by someone like Beethoven or even Bach is that we listen and we think, now that's going to happen, and it doesn't. And that's really difficult to explain. And that's what is at the basis of our attraction of it, and at the basis of our renewing of our interpretive engagement. And ultimately, we have to remember that music is actually not there to be enjoyed, well, it is there to be enjoyed, of course. It's there for so many reasons. But the way we have progressed it in our culture is that it is there as a fundamental challenge to our interpretive freedom, to our ability to interpret and seek meaning. And that's what makes it so interesting. And I just don't know whether that can ever be understood by an IA system, because there's no indication that it has a sense of consciousness, of awareness or real attention.
Well, you're setting the bar pretty high there, I think, for a machine to have a consciousness.
Well, we need a body to do that, because we need a fundamental, the duality of mind and body consciousness. Embodied consciousness is actually at the basis of our ability to become aware in the first instance.
Okay. If we, like, let me just pick one point of the things that you said and throw it to Ollie. Now, the way that you present it, in a way, it's almost like you have a protective idea about, like, particularly art music, and the music that challenges us, the type of music that kind of like moves us forward as human beings, that kind of like gives us impulse, gives us inspiration outside of what we just want to consume. But that's not the only way to consume music. A lot of people are quite happy to, quite a lot of people actually are quite happy to just consume music as something that is a pleasurable feeling, a pleasurable feeling. And a lot of composers are also quite happy to give that to the crowds. So it's kind of like, and that's not in itself wrong. It's not going to get us, it's not going to advance us as a species or anything like that. It's not going to open any intellectual kind of ideas, but it may make a lot of people feel really nice. And I think there are very formalistic or formulaic things that are happening in pop music in particular, or in techno music, rave music, that are designed to have psychological effects, particularly on crowds or on people, on people who are consuming this type of music. And I do see that computers might be quite helpful. Same with ambient music, for example, in taking over parts of the process, maybe not the whole thing, but like, I mean, we have seen in our lifetimes, we've seen software advance dramatically in terms of the things that it can do. There's all the quantizing, there's all the sort of like humanization, there's pitch correction. It's all in like $100 software these days. All these things are built in already. So it can straighten music out so it's easier to listen to. It can also do the opposite, actually. So do you see, Ollie, where do you see the role of these, tools like Magenta, for example, for Ableton, or like AI-driven tools, or that claim to be AI-driven, in the composition, which is these days for a lot of types of music the same as production. So composition and production have become the same act, more or less. Do you see a role for these things, or do you think like it'll just water down the composer's original idea?
Yeah, great question. I'd like to, I mean, this is something I'm actively researching, and I have particularly one PhD student who's looking at the human-computer interaction or user experience research into the kinds of tools that are starting to become commercially or freely available. You just mentioned Google Magenta, so people have heard of Google. It's pretty interesting, actually, that a company of that might is producing these little kind of widgets that you can do some music generation with in your workstation. And that's because they're very interested in, obviously, machine learning for all kinds of things, and they're world leaders, obviously, in that area. Google Brain is a kind of a section of Google that does that intense machine learning research for all kinds of probably brilliant and terrifying things. And music is just one of these things that people are always super interested in showing what you can do. It's this kind of wonderful test case. And it's also got a bit of a pretty shine to it. I'm sure there's a bit of that when you think of a company like Google. Anyway, so you can go download for free some software that you can do some music generation with right now, if you like. The Magenta toolkit does that. And it follows, again, there are these paradigms that have just emerged from what's possible with machine learning that tend to dictate the kinds of interfaces you might build. So one is you just press a button and it generates some stuff, limited use, but obviously that's still potentially something that people might need or want. And I'm just talking about little melodies or maybe a chord progression, not an entire symphony. So if you're, say, and I think this is really interesting because I'm a pretty, I'm a self-taught music producer. I have awful music theory. I'm tone deaf, and I make music. So how do I do that? Well, I have all these kind of tricks, and I make harmonically fairly uninteresting music. I'm more interested in rhythm and things like that. I think there's a whole load of bedroom producers and non-classically trained or non-traditionally trained musicians for whom something that might produce a coherent melody or chord progression is actually an incredibly powerful tool. They might be very talented. They might be great at humming a melody but not know how to harmonize that. So there's genuine potential there. But yeah, so these systems, one mode is that you press a button and it just generates. The other very common mode is that you feed it half of a melody and it produces the end of that melody. So basically it's called a continuation model, and it's predictive modeling. You're feeding it a couple of notes and it thinks, what's the next most likely note to happen? Maybe with a bit of randomness to make sure it doesn't do the same thing every time. There are harmonization tools, so it will give you or any kind of accompaniment type process. So you feed it one thing and it gives you something that goes with that. It might be a drum beat that pulls the groove out of a bass line. And again, this is a functional thing, very functional in the sense that we already have in our music creation tools. So we have things like groove quantize. That's a feature. If anyone makes music on a computer, they will have come across this feature. You can take your metronome drum pattern and you can give it a Latin feel, a bossa or whatever it might be. So that's a kind of user experience that we're very used to, and bringing AI into that is pretty seamless. You might have an AI groove processor. So there's all these areas where actually it's like your email spam filter. You're not really necessarily aware that it's, what kind of algorithm is going on there. The use case is already established. We want to filter spam in some way. Here's a way to do it. And then there's all this kind of profound stuff. So one of the things I'm actively researching is so I'm very interested in the creative process, and I'm very interested in the blind nature of creative search. We often actively set out strategies that are about surprising ourselves, so throwing out a load of possibilities. People have used all kinds of random techniques to get ideas on the page, and I do this all the time. I might take a sound recording, load it up, loop it, move the loop around, and suddenly something surprises me. And that's a search technique. I didn't decide what's going to happen, I searched. And AI can be obviously really interesting from that point of view, and actually even pretty dumb AI. I just gave an example of me choosing maybe a recording of the street and getting musical inspiration from that. Well, if I can get musical inspiration from a recording of the street, then it doesn't actually matter how good my AI music note generation algorithm is. It still might actually prove to be really useful. A nice quote that I use in the book that I'm putting out next year is from one founder of an AI startup company, Ava, and he makes the point that unlike self-driving cars, which cannot fail, your music generation algorithm can have a success rate of 1% or even less than 1%. It doesn't take that long to go through 100 4-bar melodies while you're sitting on the bus, and you might catch one thing. So in short, sorry that was very long, but I wouldn't want to put any money down on exactly where the interesting use cases are going to be, because this is the nature of emerging technologies, is whatever it is, I'm not going to be the one that predicts it.
Okay. I'd like to throw one thing at you out of the things that Oli just mentioned, and that's about the process of making music. So somebody who uses a kind of like experimental method of just feeding loops and kind of listening back, and then is surprised by what's being thrown back at him or her, is somebody who's essentially improvising, potentially collaborating with neural networks or things like that. Whereas the traditional idea of a composer, I suppose, was more like as someone having a pretty clear idea at the starting point of what they want to create, and then use their intentionality, that's a word that you use, in order to make that thing that has built up in his or her head come to fruition. Is that something that you would say, is that composition technique still around? Is that something that we still have? Or is that composition? Or can it be both?
I think I want to backtrack one step briefly. First of all, what I said before is not, I'm not an elitist. I don't think...
Didn't mean to imply that.
No, that's fine. But I didn't want to make an elitist point. It's not about art pour l'art as such, but we must first of all remember what opportunities we as human beings have from having created something through the history of our civilization of this kind. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, which is even more important, I'm also no enemy of pleasure. I'm actually very interested in it. Aristotle famously says there's no excellence without pleasure. My question is whether is there pleasure without excellence? And that's an intriguing question for us, because obviously music is pleasurable. It must be so. And we do amazing things with this feeling and attraction. But to your point of how composition may or may not work, or how music making, which is not a making, actually works. Imagine yourself, you play and learn the piano, say, it's simple. How does it actually work to learn how to play the piano? Well, you start to feel with your body the keys, and you feel the movements of your fingers playing, etc. You hear the sound, you learn intuitive connections between how you need to move your fingers. You in particular, because you need to, you will move your fingers in totally different ways from me ultimately, because you have a different body. So there is no technique of playing in that sense, actually. No one can give anyone else an instruction how to play the piano, except we need to discover this way through listening and feeling. That's it. Through reflection, through intuition, through listening and feeling. That's a process which unfolds many millions of times in our lives if we are a pianist or if we start learning the piano. Now, in this discussion so far, we become obsessed in AI with outcomes, with products. We're not interested really to learn the piano. We're interested how to play like something nice, something pleasurable. But actually, when we learn to play the piano, we play the piano because we want to play the piano. And what comes out at the end is something that happens in all music. We stand back and we marvel as, how has that happened? And I'm sure that's what Beethoven did when he finished his symphonies. It's not like he had a blueprint and then he put it into action. He actioned it. He worked from his sketchbooks, we know this. He worked and worked over his ideas all the time and reworked them and thought here and there. So the creation happens in the action. And that's something it is even the same when the human being speaks. There's a wonderful little essay by Heinrich von Kleist about the gradual creation of thoughts during speech. And Kleist argues famously that we actually don't think first and then speak after. We think while we speak, and we speak more, and we think a bit better, and so forth. So we need this duality of articulation, of expression, of writing something down and then finding a new way, and then write, etc. So composition is, in my view, much more of this kind of process in an authentic way. It's not something like you construct out of a flat pack. It's like the difference between making furniture like I do, sort of out of prefabricated bits from IKEA maybe, or being a real carpenter. There's a fundamental difference.
Yeah, well, there's also something to be said about the fact whether a composition process has come to an end. So whether a composer has composed something and says like, this is the thing, now play it to somebody, or plays him or herself. There are countless examples. One is pretty old, from 1787, the musikalische Würfelspiel, the musical dice game. in which several composers, including Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, set out a number of different, like just a couple of bars of a waltz, and said like you can combine these in any which way, and they will create a reasonably meaningful waltz that will sound almost the same but not exactly the same. And I had to actually Google this, sorry. The number of possibilities is 45 quadrillion different ways of playing the same composition, and not even being wrong or right, but still being within the realm of what the composer intentioned. So that's something that kind of reminds me a little bit of, you know, throwing balls at neural networks as a composer, and seeing, okay, what is it that comes back, you know, setting a couple of parameters, like setting frameworks for something to happen, and then kind of like also being on the receiving end, not on the receiving end, not only on the sending end. Is that something that, Oli, you would say AI can play a role in?
Oh, I mean, definitely. I think just in response to the dice game, which is always picked up as the introduction to a million papers that say this has a long history, and it's certainly, and probably a much longer history. But in the language of mathematics, computer science, you might talk about, and actually in the language of a field that's called computational creativity, which is one of the interesting areas where people come together to research this stuff in music, art, poetry, everything else. We quite often talk about search spaces, and again that comes back to the topic of creative search. And that might refer to the way that a creator configures their environment to sort of start searching, for example, choosing a key, choosing a scale that they might play some music in is some limitation of a search space. What you've just described is a search space that's been constrained in a very clever way so that everything sounds nice, but there's still a vast space of possibilities. But it's vast in a slightly kind of cheeky way, because actually it doesn't have a great deal of diversity. And so in the world of neural network, machine learning based music, we might use lots and lots of data, diverse data, and we'd expect diverse outcomes to come out. And that sometimes happens, sometimes doesn't. Sometimes that diversity can just mess everything up and you end up with kind of rubbish coming out. Depends how good your networks are. There's another field which is more generally maybe called generative music or generative art, and you get these coding artists who write code, and they'll sit there and write an algorithm from scratch, and that will generate some stuff. There's a very famous artist who died a couple of years ago called Harold Cohen, visual artist, who taught himself, he was a successful painter already, and he taught himself how to write Lisp programs, a certain programming language. Actually travelled from London to Silicon Valley and got immersed in the world of computing in the late 60s, and became then, kind of had a second career, became incredibly famous as a generative artist. And this was entirely rule-based art. So what that means is you just sit there and you write the algorithms. There's nothing about what came out of that process that you could ask him, why has it done that? And he'll tell you, because he knows exactly what's going on in the code. That's not the case with deep learning. Often we're actually completely mystified by what's come out. We can say what the algorithm did, but we can't necessarily tie it back to something. So in the world of generative art, that might be considered old hat. We don't need generative code-based, rule-based art, we call it sometimes, because we have machine learning. But it's actually very, potentially from a user point of view, very powerful, because it gives you that control and that ability to define search spaces. And I think we have a future where that kind of thing will always play a role, and possibly the integration of these black box machine learning systems and these representations that are like notations. They're like a form of maybe music or art representation that we might, as artists, learn. And the dice game would be an example that you learn this paradigm, this process. Another comment on the side about that is that whenever you do something like that, someone very famous comes along and introduces some new idea, their influence obviously, I think we all know this, has the potential then to change everyone's taste. We all suddenly go, oh yeah, I like this. But if it had been someone unimportant who'd suggested that, we might not have been excited about it. And that actually, I'd like to cheekily segue that to a response to some of Goetz's points, which is that I haven't heard the word social mentioned at all, maybe or not much. And I think really the key to understanding this, from my perspective, is both sociological and framed by evolutionary psychology, so framed by the understanding of what processes have shaped our brains over millennia and so on. And one of my main arguments about how we should approach this field is that we need to, we get really stuck when we ask questions like, did this machine just compose a piece of music, or was it a trick, or whatever? And it's actually the social grounding that doesn't necessarily change the outcome. Like the thing that the machine generated might sound exactly like human music, and this is why we get very tripped up. But for all of these kind of external and quite essential reasons, it doesn't sit in context in the same way. That's a really hard thing to capture. So I sort of really appreciate some of the things that Goetz is saying, but I also, my training and my background really drive me to say I really want to look at this from a sociological point of view, and probably end up saying we probably agree a lot about stuff, but from these very different perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just shows how complex music is for our consciousness and what dimensions are involved, and I very much agree. The point is that really music, you could see it almost as an externalization of our consciousness, our subjective consciousness, full stop. And of course you have social dimensions, you have metaphysical dimensions, you have all sorts of intellectual and emotive, all sorts of things. Everything is there.
Yeah, is it? Yeah, so that's the idea of, like, when you listen to a song or to a piece of music, you're listening to a package that includes massive social context. It includes something about what the person who made the music or makes the music looks like, what they say. It includes the lyrics. It includes the context of other artists who are also performing, maybe in the same genre, maybe different genre. So everything is super referential. And I'm a total nerd for this kind of stuff. I love it. I'm not necessarily convinced that, or I'm a little bit worried that, especially in the day and age of streaming services, that some of that context is stripped of the music because it's just algorithms hammering out more and more and more of the same, and you don't even, or people may not go down that road of finding out, okay, where does it actually come from? When was it written? And which culture does it stem from? You know, what kind of is the context? Who may not put in sort of like the extra research or the extra work or interest because it just floats past them. I'm not sure if that's necessarily, it's not, I don't have data or anything or statistics on that. It's just a feeling that I have with the younger generations growing up who, I don't know, don't ask these types of questions. And again, like, I'm not saying that that's wrong, particularly in pop music. You know, if we drive on Monday morning, we drive to work in a traffic jam, we listen to It's Just Another Manic Monday. Like, everyone, maybe, I don't know how many % of the people think of the Bangles, and certainly nobody, or hardly anyone would think that it's not actually a Bangles song. Prince wrote that song.
They should know
yeah,
it's the Bangles.
But Prince wrote that song, you know. You fall in love, you sing along to Sinead O'Connor, and it's also a Prince song, you know, nothing compares to you.
Yeah, but that shows very clearly is that we are very, whether we look at it from the social point of view or individual or whatever, we frame it very much in the context of consumption. Music as a product of consumption in the marketplace, and AI, of course, can deliver certain segments of that marketplace, supply that very well, including, you know, at home when you want to play around with your own musical enthusiasm and stuff. But the really important question for us should also be, what does that do to very fundamental traits in music that actually enhance our consciousness and our intelligence as human beings, and have over centuries, namely the ability for freedom of intuition to be exercised. What does that do in serving all these masses of slick forms of consumptions to us in music?
Well, I mean, I would say that there's enough of a critical mass of people who are very interested in this, in driving music forward. And I would also make a point or argue that some of these people are also interested in AI, and maybe particularly now, or in machine learning, or whether that could be one of those tools that we don't know yet. I mean, just like the piano, we didn't know what a piano was 2,000 years ago. There was also music then, but like, you know, and the piano also kind of did, or like a lot of musical instruments, tools, kind of like didn't only provide a way forward, it also took some things away from us. Like we can't play quarter notes on this thing. Like there's a large part of the music of the cultures of the world that we cannot replicate with these things, and we're stuck in this 12-tone octave and all this kind of stuff. And also, like, institutions teach composers how to do things as well. I mean, that even in art music, or so it's not like so a machine listening to a large amount of data is not so, maybe, or arguably not so different to a person listening to their favorite composers, their favorite bands, whatever, try to sound like that, kind of emulate the tricks of the trade, sort of thing, get that on board as their skill set, and then produce something initially maybe that is quite similar to their idols in any genre, I would say, and then kind of like maybe then have like a creative idea that sets you out of that makes you jump outside of that box, and that probably, or that could be the key component that is, or the key question with machines, whether they are able, will ever be able to have enough sort of creative intuition to leave that kind of set of tasks or the parameters or framework that we need to give them. If we don't give that to them, they're going to create music that's, I don't know, has a note every 300 years and it's so high not even the dogs can hear it or something. You know, they're not going to, like, we have to give them rules. And if we give them rules, can they then still have enough confidence almost to say like, nah, actually, you know what, I'm going to break that rule. I know it's usually A, B, A, B, C, C, A, but like I think this saxophone solo in the third part of the song, we've heard enough of that. I mean, you know, let's have something else.
So I think, again, it comes back to framing all this stuff in terms of social embeddedness and context. The kinds of scenarios you're talking about, I mean, I think we're starting to see very interesting practice of speculative design, where actually the way you start to think through this stuff is by throwing out a scenario like that or a situation and just sort of working through conceptually how that might play out. Coming back to one of your earlier points, the kids are going to be fine, don't worry, because it's the same with photography, it's the same with Photoshop, it's the same with synthesizers, drum machines. There's this kind of continuum, like, I think the drive for cultural interaction through these media, like music and art and poetry and literature and fashion, haircuts, and one of the important things about this drive is that it does just keep changing. That's the point. There is a certain novelty drive. That's what you're doing. You're actually showing off and communicating and saying, look at me, I'm original. And there's, again, this comes out to a whole load of evolutionary psychology about the kinds of things. I don't want to be like reductionist. Very important to caveat discussion around evolutionary psychology. I don't mean that there's a gene for artistry or anything, but to understand that there are certain things that we're doing socially when we do aesthetic performance and stuff, big story and not very well understood, but clearly something that's really important. So I think in one sense the kids will be okay, because there will just be these new genres and new things and new weird ways that we're already too old ourselves to understand, and it'll be terrifying for us but fun for them. They'll have a riot. But there are these dangers as well. So one of the things is we could talk about, say, film music and the way that orchestras used to play that stuff and now synthesizers play that stuff, and it's got a bit worse. I mean, arguably, maybe actually you like it. But there's this economic drive which in many fields can just undermine something that was really good. It happens in every, you know, fast fashion, fast food, it happens everywhere, and it happens in the arts, and we have to resist that, but also we have to be aware of our potential elitism and check ourselves as well, and not just say, oh, you know, it's better in the old days, and that's not going to go down well. Yeah,
but you know, you have to see that the health cost of fast food production is enormous, and similarly the spiritual cost of fast food music is also enormous, because what it reduces a very essential human capacity, that's the embodied consciousness. That's fundamentally required for the way we have developed some areas of our music to a highest level.
But that is much harder to measure than the health
well,
cost of fast food.
Well, it's not measurable at all. That's my point. The point is that reducing music to the measurable is fundamentally already committing a category mistake, if you like. And so I can't see at this point conceptually that what is being claimed is actually possible. I think what's possible are the illusions of presence and the illusions of music. Yes, by all means, but that's like when you're on Zoom and talking to somebody. The illusion of the person is for sure there, but the person is not really there, and the interaction is very different.
Well, that's one of the reasons why we're very happy to have all these wonderful, beautiful people here in the room, not only on the screens. For those who are on the screens, please do use the CreativeAI hashtag to participate in this conversation. We are almost at the end of our time, maybe not at the end of our wits. That's for others to say. I'm sorry, that was bad. Well, we have a little bit more time. Goetz, one thing that I wanted to ask you, one effect that your article had on me was that a certain group of words kind of jumped out at me, and I, whether consciously or not, kind of grouped them in that way. And another group of words also jumped out. So one was quantitative, analytical, imitative, forgeries. That kind of described the realm of the machine. Correct me if that's wrong. And then mystery, consciousness, intentionality, imagination, and things like a riddle. That would describe the realm of the human. Now, that's like super binary. I'm not saying that you actually wrote it like that. It's just sort of the way that I read it after a while. Like I reread it a few times, and that kind of like it emerged from the text at some point. Do you think or do you both think that there's a good chance that these things have enough potential to overlap to create an art that is perhaps advanced to the art that we know now? If we use the strengths out of both worlds, sort of thing, can we progress?
I think the fundamental feature of the human being is that it's precisely the location where both those streams, if you like, combine. And this is precisely what we, how we live, and that's how we create. Because we are able to combine intuition and analysis, and we know the limits of analysis, perhaps, and etc. We know the opportunities of imagination, etc. This is a very complex topic, but I think the human being is characterized by at least potentially combining these two fields, streams, if you like, to a very sophisticated and ever-changing and exciting level. If that is supposed to be created in a system, I can't speculate, I don't really know enough about this, but I would go back to my earlier point. I think it needs to be an embodied consciousness. It's not enough to create intelligent systems, it's also not enough to create learning systems. This system would need to have a biological, the way I can only conceive it, would need to have a biological basis, or it would need to be God.
Okay, that's a heavy word there at the end of the sentence. So that Dionysus kind of like the that the God created out of or like the golem, or like what are we looking at? You know?
Well, I'm just using it as a conceptual term. It would have to be a form of consciousness which is all encapsulating some Plotinian idea of a one, because what makes us fundamentally different is the embodied consciousness. It's the fact that we have a body and that we think with our body. We don't just think with our minds.
Okay, I've got a few questions from the audience. One is from our director, Sonja Griguszewski, who's also right here. She asks, why do we want to imitate human skills? What is it that drives us to have machines imitate the things that essentially are the things that make us human, or arguably the things that make us human, such as composing, drawing, speaking, translating? That goes to both of you guys.
I have a quick answer. I think that's been at the basis of a lot of AI, is because we hope to understand ourselves through this form of creation. And it actually, we have understood more of ourselves through it. That's how I think we could look at it. I think Margaret Bowden, who's an AI researcher, that's basically what she would say as well.
I agree with that, and I think there's a few other answers to that. I think I certainly got into this because I was just fascinated with, you know, how far can I push this? Like, how cool a thing can I make? That's the kind of engineers. It's actually, you know, I mean, there might be a commercial. Increasingly now, this thing is framed in a commercial drive, partly because of where the technology's got to, partly because of the way that academia is now told to do things, and partly because there is actually a commercial potential market out there. But most of the people I know who got into this in academia, one of the things is understanding humans, understanding ourselves on a more or less philosophical level. Another is just understanding the machine, like, and that's, I think, where I've really sat. So you could just say it's the same as, like, you know those amazing, I always forget what they're called, those amazing machines where the marble goes down and knocks over a balloon, and what are they called? Rube Goldberg machines. You know, how cool a machine can I make is pretty much, you know, like what a lot of people are motivated to do here. And we come back to the Huey thing. You know, that's kind of what's there. Is like, you know, let's put something up there for everyone to be amazed by, be disgusted by, be interested by, and drive a discussion. There's a lot of that in there. But yeah, no, go on.
Just as a sort of little postscriptum, as a philosophical person, I'm also keenly aware that in any attempt to understand and gather understanding, we create realms of ignorance. So every understanding includes its own limitation already to a certain extent. So I think that's something we are starting to forget in our mesmerization with the systems.
It's a beautifully creative field in that sense. It's always going to actually open up. I mean, as we always hear, like, more questions than the ones you've answered.
We've got another question, this time from Andre Leslie, who works on this website as well. He asks, is AI use, the use of AI in pop music and modern music going to lead us towards one type of song? I guess flattening the format, is that what we're going to see?
I'd like to know whether the person asking the question thinks that's a good thing or a bad thing. Like, we've finally, it's like 1984, you know, we've finally managed to get all music down to one song. Yeah. We've done it.
The song.
I'm assuming there's an assumption there that it's a bad thing. No, I don't think it will, because actually, I mean, I think there are going to be these reductive processes, which we've already seen. They already kind of do happen in the, particularly in the commercial space, where there's, you know, risk aversity and how do I make sure it sounds like what people expect, and less adventurism. But actually, again, coming back to some of the algorithms that I've worked in, and we haven't mentioned it, but actually there's this other field called evolutionary algorithms, or sometimes search and optimization algorithms, which in my view, have actually really interesting potential for creativity because they're a bit like nature. Nature's process of natural selection, which created the things, the plants and the animals around us, clearly a process that's capable of creative diversity generation. And we have algorithms that do that kind of thing. So if they turn out to work nicely, then we might end up in a world of that kind of, we might end up with this sort of enhancement and crazy new things that are very exciting, but they may not work out that well, and we might end up in some sort of reductionist hell. But I don't think so, because I mean, there won't be a market for it.
I think in the postmodern aesthetics, you would have a huge variety of all sorts of different things. And it's a bit like our food culture or anything like that. You can eat anything, anywhere. And so you're going to have any song anywhere, in any style, or combination of styles, or whatever is possible.
I've got one more question. We're going to have to keep it a little bit brief. From Florian Hammerbacher. How far do you see, do the panelists think are we away from AI-based music for crowd control or in stores? And I'm reading, I hope I'm not reading the wrong thing into this, but it's kind of like has a little bit of a political dimension, I guess, in terms of like manipulation of the masses. Is that something that's in the cards for AI-based music, or is that, could that be a driver into that direction?
One of the good things about the technological revolution is that you have sound cancelling headphones. So I will go into crowds with a Bruckner symphony in my headphones.
Yeah, right, your defensive technology, your armor against crowd control, mind control.
I don't think that's going to be actually possible, because people do have headphones in all the time. They listen to their own music. That's actually quite a nice thing to do.
I think, I mean, it's the Pied Piper in a way, like the Pied Piper parable. And let's not forget that, I mean, as far as I know, you can't play a melody that makes someone kind of follow you down the street. So it does, music has incredible, powerful effect on our brains, but it's not actually that, it's got limits, it's not that powerful. But I've been wondering, and I've been particularly like following all of this stuff around, you know, the last US election and Cambridge Analytica modeling every single individual in an electorate and being able to target them with individual adverts using, I don't know how much AI there is, but obviously AI has this great potential on very long time scales. And really important question is, you know, where did your music taste come from? Came from the people around you. That doesn't make it okay, by the way. You know, you might you know, that could mean, that could influence you in any number of ways. Your kind of embodied culture sort of has the potential then to steer you in certain directions about your politics or whatever. I really fear the way that social media based, you know, kind of analytics and stuff is having the potential to kind of get in under our skin. I don't think it's anywhere near controlling us, but I do think in the long term that's a serious consideration. And the world of the aesthetic is part of that war front eventually, you know, it plays a role.
But the fact that the prediction on the US election went so wrong is actually very heartening, because it shows that people do exercise freedom of judgment. Whether it's a good thing or bad thing in this case, I don't know, but anyway, they do. And that's what we forget in all this data analysis and prediction. We are not making decisions based on data gathering ourselves. We're making spontaneous free decisions every day, many of them. And I think we shouldn't get carried away with being mesmerized by how much data we can actually gather. That's actually not that significant for our life anyway.
Okay, now we're doing something that I swore we wouldn't do, which is kind of like going away from AI and music and talking about AI itself. But I'm guilty myself. I've got one last question, and then we're going to have to wrap it up, because we will actually listen to some real music from a real person who is sitting right there. We're very much looking forward to that. Sophie?
I see drum machines and synthesizers.
It's real. You can touch it. So last question, and I don't mean to sound cynical, but like AI has been around for a long time. There is a phenomenon which I haven't heard from other areas of science. Maybe it exists, I'm not sure. But there's the term AI winter. So in the late 70s and the late 80s, that there was this effect of hyper hype, so to speak. Lots of funding, lots of ideas, lots of interest from the public. Films were made, all this kind of stuff, and that dried up like a bubble. It happened again, and it dried up again. And right now we see. Obviously it's algorithms because I work for this thing, but I see this all the time at the moment. Everyone's talking about it. Do you think there's a potential that we are somehow overestimating, that the discourse is somehow overestimating the importance of this kind of matter at the moment? Or has that train left the station and AI has become such an integral part of every individual's life that we cannot afford not to talk about it anymore? What's your take on that?
Well, a bit of everything. I mean, some people are definitely overhyping it, without any doubt. It's kind of painful sometimes just how much zealotry there is out there. But yeah, you're kind of referring to this idea of hype cycles, right? Like technology, you have a killer demo, and so that people think that it's all just going to change overnight, but actually something's not been considered, and we can see that with autonomous vehicles, which are already proving to be fiddlier than we think. I think I've just completely lost train of my thoughts, so we've got the hour mark, so over to you.
Look, in terms of music, I sort of stick to music a bit. I think I'm actually very optimistic. I think there are obviously exciting things happen, and people can do things much more autonomously at home that they might enjoy and also learn from, etc. And there are marvelous opportunities. AI is here to stay, of course, and will develop. But we should always remember what is essential to our humanity and creative humanity, and be also conceptually clean in our thoughts and not label something as creative that actually isn't creative. I mean, not in the real sense. And we are very loose with our terms. We quickly say, oh, isn't that a genius product? And when we look closer, it's actually not. It's neat and nifty, but it's pretty simple. So we shouldn't get mesmerized and too quickly taken in by impressions, I think. AI is great and will be here to stay, and music has a lot to say. Composers will use it, and we'll use it in sophisticated ways. There'll be all sorts of possibilities we can't yet foresee, but there'll be things it won't be able to do and shouldn't do, probably, I don't know, but we should not lose sight of our autonomous human ability, and particularly what makes us musical and cultural and creative, which is our capacity for spontaneity and freedom of thought.
That's a wonderful ending sentence there from you, Goetz. Very optimistic. I love that. That's great. I'm going to close with a quote, which is something that I stole from Sonia. She did it last time when she sat here in my place with Toby Walsh and Belinda Dunstan, both from UNSW, who had a fantastic talk on humans and AI, and it touched mostly on the more ethical and kind of on these types of things. You can find that on the website as well. It's been recorded. So jump on goethe.de/CreativeAI, goethe.de/CreativeAI, and that will get you there, and you will be able to kind of get a sense of what they talked about at that point. The quote is from Eben Moglen, or Eben, I'm not sure. He's the guy, the founder of Software Freedom Law Center, and I saw him speak at Republica conference in Berlin last year, I think it was, and he said that one of the main dangers that we have is that the digital stream that we're subjected to drowns out the inner dialogue. That was a beautiful image, I thought, and I hope that's something that we didn't do today. For those who are sitting in front of their screens, I hope we didn't add to that. But I think there is a lot of inspiration to be had from your beautiful contributions, and thank you for your not only for what you said today, also for coming in, of course, and participating in the project, but also in the things that you've written for us for Kultur magazine. Please jump on the website. It's the magazine is obviously limited in its capacity. It's got just the paper thing, but the website is always growing, and we're adding and adding and adding new articles about all sorts of Kulturtechnik and AI. So thank you very much to our speakers, Goetz Richter from the Conservatorium of Music.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Oliver Bown from UNSW Art and Design.
Thank you.
My name is Jochen. I'd like to thank our director, Sonia Grigoszewski, who invented this entire whole thing. And without her, none of us would be sitting here, and none of us would be thinking and doing all these wonderful things. Also, thank you to Andre Leslie, who has been behind all the Twitter sphere and all this kind of stuff today. He's also one of the editors for the website. Barbara Gruber is another colleague of ours who has also worked on the website. My colleague all the white men talking on stage are going away, and now there's finally a woman, and she's the only one who actually will perform and actually create some art for us. So her name is Sofie Loizou, and she performs under the name Anomie. She's a wonderful producer and performer, and she uses a lot of very interesting machines, and it's anyone's guess what they do. I can't figure it out. And it's also anyone's guess whether any AI is involved in that or not. Sometimes people claim it's involved, sometimes they don't. Anyway, I'm very much looking forward to now hearing your live set. We'll go off stage, they will play the video, you'll come on, and we will be listening to your music. Thank you, Anomie, in advance. Thank you.